And our fabulous panel today, we have Shiwa, who is a senior UX designer with IAG. We have Marc, who's the head of APAC prototyping at Amazon Web Services, and Gus Balbonton, who is an investor, founder, advisor, and all-round good guy from Rochambeau Studios. My name's David. I'm Professor and Director of Entrepreneurship at Monash Business School, and I lead the Entrepreneurship portfolio. And on that note, are we ready to get started? Well, what I'd like to do today is just frame where we're at. We have many students in the house today, and they've got a couple of assessments coming up around prototyping. But I think it's really important to understand, why do we actually prototype? I mean, it's a buzzword that's thrown around. So I might throw to Gus to lead us off on that one, mate. Why do we actually prototype?
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. So, look, David, I think I always say that, often in entrepreneurship, there is this illusion that we race towards a moment in which we raise capital, right? Everyone kind of talks about this idea of, okay, you get a startup going, or you're an entrepreneur and you build a business, and then you get to a point where you raise capital, right? That's kind of like a success metric of some kind. But the truth is that your time, your personal life experience, your time is far more important than anybody else's money, right? So if you value your time really highly, you want to prototype. And what that means is you want to test that whatever it is that you're going to be working on is actually worth your time. Otherwise, why would you do it, right? So I think, to me, that's the real value, is why is it that I'm going to spend my time on this? Like, the first proof point is to yourself, not to anybody else. It's like, does this make sense? And the customer is the one that tells the story, right? So if you're not directly engaging with them to tell you if this is worth your time, then kind of don't do it.
Great point. Yeah, I like that. Time is valuable, and we're also busy. Shiwa, from your perspective, why is prototyping important?
I think to follow on from Gus' time, but also the money-wise, every idea we kind of pitch to the business or the hire and the stakeholder in the company, we have to address. It's like taking on a risk. Would the business pay for 7 weeks for us to kind of pursue this idea, and the cost involved in the experiments? And we want to de-risk it as much as we can with certain level of confidence. And I think prototype ties into that confidence level. So we have a higher confidence that this is worth kind of for the business to go on and develop this or build this on as well. So it's all about managing the risk levels.
Fantastic, and great contrast and alignment with the answers there. And Marc, from Amazon Web Services point of view, why do you guys prototype?
I love this question. And I think, you get various different answers from various different customers, depending on which sort of segment they are, whether they're sort of large enterprise customers or whether they're startup customers. But there is a common thread that runs across all of them. And the first one is organizations, as they want to accelerate their businesses, and especially in these COVID times, being able to validate an idea and fail fast is critically important. So it kind of plays into that theme of being frugal with your time and making the right decisions as quickly as possible and validating those. So failing fast and failing cheap is certainly one reason that our customers love to prototype. The second element is the customers that we deal with, a lot of them are visionary technologists, and they find it quite a challenge to take their stakeholders on the journey. And a prototype allows them to demonstrate the art of the possible at a very low cost. And to take those stakeholders on the journey. And we find that customers who prototype and get stakeholders on board early have a much higher chance of being able to drive these ideas through to production or through a capital raise in the case of a startup. So it's these factors that we see come into play. A lot of them are around driving stakeholder management and managing time.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've got value, we've got de-risking, we've got speed and execution, but the common thread there is it's all pull from market, isn't it? It's about actually understanding what the market is after. Great answers. Now on to, how do you actually go about prototyping? And our audience is very, very interested in learning about approaches, tools. How do you measure outcomes? I'd like to hear a little more about that. And Shiwa, would you like to lead off this time?
Sure. I think it's the step beforehand, so determining which experiment you take. And I think prototype is very much tied to the experiment you choose to. For example, after you figure out the riskiest assumption you want to take and then the experiment tied to it, then the prototype that suits that experiment. So for example, if it's like a Wizard of Oz, then your prototype is quite different, as in you have to set up a process of people to do the back end. One example, we had a concept called a quick quote. So people can take a photo of like their competitors' car insurance bill, they take a photo and we quickly give them a NRMA quote equivalent. And so it'll take a lot of technology to build that. So our Wizard of Oz is we got grads to manually kind of background, quickly enter their details into our manual process and email it to them. So they think it's like a real technology doing it. So that type of prototype is very different to, for example, we created an explainer video attached to a discovery survey. So that prototype is explainer video. That includes storyboarding, writing a script, getting like programs. I used iMovie because it was free and cheap, and also I had Principal program, which was already available, paid for by the business, where I can do animations. Versus if you want to do something that's a clickable prototype, then that really depends on the skill set that you already have. If you don't have much skill set in prototyping, then maybe paper prototypes or drawing storyboards, they may be easier. But I find UX designers generally have a specialization in prototyping, so it's quite easy for them to mock up a digital and clickable prototype, and there's a lot of programs, and depending on your project, you choose a program that fits that kind of interactivity or more basic, just images, that's the basic click-through.
Fantastic. Shiwa, Wizard of Oz came up in class the other night. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. I mainly work in digital. So there's also like concierges, which is more maybe a physical service. Wizard of Oz is more like the equivalent of the digital service, but we had to cost save this experiment. So we ended up stacking an experiment of an online Google ad followed by a landing page, followed by a Wizard of Oz. Because the problem with a Wizard of Oz, you need the eyeballs on it. So we already paid for a Google online ad. We already had a fake landing page. And if they further went onto it, that's when we had the Wizard of. The problems with that is it's actually a lot of prep work around that, because we couldn't just shut it off, the Google ads. It was 24/7, or we had to cater who's going to be online and up. And it's also our wages is quite expensive. So we got the grads to also do a lot of that manual process of kind of putting in those details. So yeah, that's a bit about the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, so you're actually creating a reality that isn't a reality, like the story of the Wizard of Oz. And so for all of our students out there, it's not about having to be high tech, high resolution immediately. What Shiwa had people doing manual stuff in the background, which presented actually a digital front face, which is quite an interesting way of going about prototyping. Marc, how do you guys go about prototyping at AWS?
Yeah, it's a slightly different approach. And I think that's really interesting for the audience to get these different perspectives today. So we're really driven at AWS by what we call our leadership principles. And the key one that really comes into play when we think about prototyping for customers is customer obsession. And customer obsession is making sure that we're really drilling into the value that we can deliver to a customer, and making sure that we're doing that in an accommodating way. So one of the mechanisms that we use in prototyping is to really take this business first approach. So for a lot of people, prototyping is around technology. It's how do I take this idea, manifest it in some implementation, and get people to use it. We work backwards from the customer, and we try to deeply understand what the business outcome and the impact on their business they're trying to achieve. So what we do is we actually create a document that is a pure business document where we really drill into those business impacts and business outcomes that the stakeholders want to get from the prototype, and what are the criteria of the prototype that would lead them to take the next step on the journey. So we really think that prototyping, it's not necessarily about tech. Of course, it manifests somewhere along the line in terms of tech, but we think it's about impact outcomes. And we also believe that scope is secondary. Technology scope is secondary to understanding those business impacts, because unless you can deliver the business outcome to the customer, then it doesn't matter what tech you pour into it. You've got to really focus on making sure the tech and the underlying mechanism, systems, processes, whether it's the Wizard of Oz, alternate reality process, can deliver that outcome. And then the general advice, I would give around prototyping is, as you look to build prototyping mechanisms and capabilities in your organizations or in your customers, things like making sure that you're iterating very fast. You don't want to be doing long sprints of significant development investment. You really want to decompose this down into small, demonstrable, incremental pieces of work that you can iterate very fast. And then based on that, you want to be demonstrating that to your stakeholders very often in the context of the business outcome they're trying to address. Because quite often your stakeholders that you might be presenting to are not technologists. They may not understand some of those underlying pieces of tech. They're really focused on, is this going to give us, for example, the customer experience or the cost optimization or the improved throughput through our sales pipeline? And make sure you're soliciting feedback very, very often. And I think the final thought on that is, as you're building out these processes, if you identify you need to do something more than once, mechanize it and automate it so you don't need to ever have to do it again. You don't need to think about it again. Get that process right, industrialize it and mechanize it. So it is completely repeatable, and you can focus on that business value, not some of the underlying mechanisms, because you have already industrialized and made those reusable within your own processes or your systems or your automation.
Fantastic, Mark. I just want to tease out a couple of things there. You spoke about criteria. Could you give us some examples of what that criteria might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, if I look across our customers, we see a lot of focus on innovation. And it can be quite hard when you're thinking about innovation. It's a very broad term, right? And it can mean many different things to many different people. So quite often organizations come up and they say to us, we want to innovate. How do we do that? And there is no secret recipe. Obviously, an organization like AWS belonging to Amazon, we're known as quite an innovative organization. But what works for us may not work for our customers. So we go on this journey of helping them to create a vision for the future and then work backwards. And what that does is it keeps the outcome front and center. And we do that through a process that we call the PRFAQ, press release, frequently asked questions. So we work with our customers through what we call the working backwards process. We help them to envision a future and articulate that in a press release. What would they like to see be out in the public should they be successful? And then we work backwards from that, and then we address all of the questions that come out of that in the FAQ. So if that's the outcome you want to achieve, what resources do you need? What budget do you need? Where are skills gaps in the organization? Do we have the operational capability? Do we have the sales capability? And that becomes the driving force for the vision. So we work backwards. That's really one of our key mechanisms.
Wow, fantastic. That's a technique we've actually used in class with our friends from Isobar. Great point, Mark. In terms of go-to tools, anything that is immediately, you guys go to?
I've got the two best tools, and they're the two cheapest tools you can find out there. That's a pen and paper. And we start there. We do a lot of brainstorming, sketching, whiteboarding, and that could be whether it's a UI or UX, whether it could be a customer journey. So we really start very simply. And the other tool that you have, and actually costs zero, is right here. We talk and we communicate a lot, and we share ideas and we ideate as much as we can. And we don't sit on concerns either. So pen and paper, communication are the first two tools. There are a whole plethora of technology tools, of course, and capabilities out there. And you could pick any number of them, and I'm certainly not going to recommend one over another, because they're all kind of fit for purpose for different sorts of things. And I would encourage everybody, as you're building out your capabilities, whether that be for yourselves or for an organization, to experiment with different tools. Do your own experimentation. And if it doesn't quite feel right up front, fail it fast and try another tool. Don't overinvest time. Your gut feel is quite often right in the long run. So trust your gut. If it doesn't quite feel right, pivot, make a change. It's very cheap these days to experiment. You take a $5 a month subscription for a tool, test it, doesn't work, it's $5, right? So just fail fast, test lots of different tools. But I would say sort of, obviously from AWS, we're heavy in the cloud space. That repeatability and that automation, and you would hear tools or sort of mechanisms around continuous delivery, continuous integration, those sort of capabilities, whether they be on AWS or on premises within your organization, they're incredibly powerful tools to build those out, to give you a delivery mechanism, a technology delivery mechanism that is highly reliable. So there's no variability in your ability to test things quickly and to fail fast.
Excellent. Yeah, that fit for purpose is so critical. Looks like we've just lost Gus. I was just about to throw to him and bring in the startup perspective. Hopefully he'll join us back in a quick minute. But yeah, look, that whole sort of fit for purpose is so important. At the preface of this, I was actually going to tell a quick little anecdote. My background's in electronic engineering, and as a young engineer, we used to get these circuit diagrams, and we had to imagine products and services from a static circuit diagram with capacitors and diodes and all kinds of stuff happening. And it was just impossible to do. And I was fortunate enough to go to Silicon Valley to work with Sun Microsystems in the mid-'80s. Walked into there with a crazy guy called Bill Joy, and he was so anti-circuit diagram, and what we were the task we were put to us was to pull things apart, rebuild them so that you could actually show people what you were visioning. And that for me was just opened up so many different doors. It was so powerful to move from the static to the visual. And it's something that stuck with me for a long, long time. And coming into academia, when I first entered academia, students were being asked to develop business plans. And again, it was all about that sort of aspirational, write in a document, tell us what you're going to do in the future. The power I see in prototyping is actually you're showing us what the future could look like. And there's a very, very big difference there. And it's been fascinating to hear from both of you, similar tools, but very, very different approaches. But likewise, the fit for purpose. And Gus has just moonshotted back in from outer space. Welcome back, mate.
Sorry, Tim, my computer just decided to restart on its own.
That's all right. It's been unstable the last couple of days, the whole network. Gus, I was just saying to the guys that, we've had some great perspectives from a UX perspective, from Amazon perspective. The startup perspective is similar, but very, very different. And so you might walk us through your approach to actually prototyping some of the ideas and how to bring an idea to actually a commercial reality.
And it's really important for all the people listening that, and I think Marc kind of mentioned it, is a different perspectives, right? We've got a perspective that is very digital and very much about using certain tools to put in front of customer solutions that are corporate solutions, right? With Marc, we've got prototyping that has to do with, B2B, business problems that his customers have, and then how do you fix them and achieve the customer's goals, etc. But with my entrepreneurial heart and let's say looking at my portfolio of investments, I've got the variety. I've got from genetic companies that work in health to, all the way to, back in the day when I launched a juice bar in Argentina, right? And effectively all our entrepreneurial endeavors and all can be prototyped in some way, shape or form. I think I'll pick on a couple of things that both Shiwa and Marc mentioned. One is understanding your problem as well as you possibly can. That's number one. Like, what is it that you're trying to fix? In Marc's case, is the business outcome needs to be blah. This is why that beautiful concept of positioning yourself. What are people going to ask you? What is the media going to say about you? What do you want to achieve? Like, place yourself at the end and then work your way back. So what is the problem that you fix? What is it that you need to scratch that is itching, effectively in the customer? So that's number one. The second thing is, of course, your solution, right? So my solution to that problem is this, right? And I remember that it's always a hypothesis. So I think she said it at one point in time is, because it's a hypothesis, you need to test your riskiest assumptions, right? What is it that you're assuming that it's going to happen with the behavior of the customer or the solution being fixed? And that's where the prototyping comes in. Often the first solution is actually the easiest. Coming up with the ideas to test the idea is really hard, because you need to really sit there hard, pen and paper, like Marc said, and go, how the fuck do I test this thing? Like, what is it that I do cheaply, fast, quickly, with no money, no people, no time, no nothing, and still get my riskiest assumption tested, right? And the reason why you want that is, again, first and foremost for yourself, but as Shiwa and Marc said, you need to convince your stakeholders, your investors. You're like, you got everyone in there. So it's really important. Now, I'll give you an example, which I think is going to be awesome for everyone to listen. And again, it's so kind of weird that people don't think that you can test it, but of course you can. When I was young, I observed that Boost Juice, I don't know if you know the company Boost Juice, right? Everyone loves it. I was young, thirsty entrepreneur, thought, I know what to do. I'll take Boost Juice to Latin America because it's not there. And everyone wants the juice, I'm sure, right? So off I went, grabbed a bunch of money of my own bank account, got a couple of people involved with it. And here's how I started the business. I started the business by, first and foremost, giving myself a title and creating a business card. Brilliant move, right? The last thing you want to do is, so I did that first, then I built a website, then I went and got real estate and actually found a real estate agent to give me a space to rent. I rented the place, right? Then I thought I need the blenders and the fridges and so on. So I went and bought those in Brazil and imported them into Argentina. So I did all those things. And eventually, I still remember this, you won't believe this, the day before opening the doors, we were still working at the menu. The day before, right? I was still trying to figure out what is it that we're going to give these people. I don't know, but I've got the rental space, which is important, and I got the blender too. Now, I made every possible mistake you can possibly make as an entrepreneur, right? I put all the money. We did it at one point in time. We did. Someone asked me, "But did you talk to the customers?" I said, "Yeah, we did market research. We sat a company that did market research on the corner of the place we're going to rent to ask people if they would drink an orange juice." And everyone would say, yes, of course they would. Like, yeah, an orange juice, epic, right? Or, Anyway, turns out that we launched, we ran the business for a couple of years. It was mildly successful. We eventually sold the business. But let me tell you what it would have been a prototype, right? And hopefully some of your audience are already thinking about it. A prototype would have been getting mom's blender or dad's blender, just bringing it over, putting a little trolley on a bike, going across different corners of Buenos Aires, blending different fruits and juices and whatever, talking to people about what they thought was working or not, making little tiny tasters, etc. Before we even gone down the path of business cards, websites, rental equipment, you know what I mean? Like, so you can't even test that at juice bar. You can. Like, there's no reason why you can't prototype something like that to test your biggest assumption, which is what are the flavors of something that people are going to enjoy and are they going to or not, right? But yeah, so don't underestimate the importance of understanding the problem, the solution, your highest risk, and then how quickly you can test that. Despite what it could be technology, design, it could be a B2B, so it doesn't matter what it is, but you can always find a way to test them.
Could I just chime in there if that's okay, Professor? It's really interesting to listen to you, Gus. First of all, I would buy anything from you. You've just got such energy and passion. It's amazing. But I've got this saying that I continually share with my teams that a solution looking for a problem is a problem in itself, right? You need to identify what you're trying to do. If you just have something and you try and shoehorn it into something that it doesn't fit, you're going to have a lot of challenges, and you might have a lot of blenders and rotten fruit, right? In your example. So a lot of people have great ideas. Turning those into reality, you have to work backwards. You have to really understand what you're going after. So I just think that statement there, you know, a solution looking for a problem is a problem in itself. If that's one thing everybody can take away from today, I'd be super happy.
Yeah. And remember, David, we mentioned this before many times. Don't fall in love with your ideas, right? Or your solutions. Remember, they're just a hypothesis, right? Fall in love with the process of discovering what your customers want, how to discover the problem, how to test the idea. Fall in love with that bit, not with your own idea, because the moment you fall in love with it, you become biased. And once you bias towards yourself, you're in real trouble, real trouble.
Absolutely, mate. We can't, emphasize that enough. And hopefully all of our students out there that are listening to this, this is really, really important. And you will now understand why we spend so much time on the problem space. Because as human beings, we're hardwired to jump to solutions. And we do this continually. So what part of what we do is teach our students to step back, slow it down. You've got to understand what the problem is before you can solve it.
The other thing I'd like to add to that, if I could, Professor, is we need to be aware that we're not aware of our unconscious biases.
Good point.
So in terms of stepping back, you can only do that so far. So I encourage everybody to find a confidant that's outside of your industry, your speciality, your focus area, somebody that you can talk to, that you can listen to their feedback, that will call you out, right? Hey, you're too married to this idea. Think about it in a different way. Spin it 360 degrees and see what comes around. You really need somebody that is going to give you that critical feedback and make you aware of your unconscious biases, because we do unconsciously get married to our own ideas. And unless you have somebody challenging you, and that's not somebody in your team, that's not somebody that reports to you, that's not even necessarily your investor, because you've all got vested interests. That's why they're called an investor. You need somebody to challenge you outside of that sphere and push you outside of your comfort zone, and continue to do that through your journey. So coaching, mentoring, confidants are incredibly valuable assets that you should be building in your network.
Yeah.
Sorry, another quick thing that you just reminded me is interesting, because we think that sometimes talking to customers is like the equivalent of some sort of good insight into what's going on. Be very careful, right? This is why prototyping, another reason why it's so important. There's a big difference between asking the customer, would you like an orange juice, and actually blending something and putting them in front of them to see if they'll pay money for. It's very different, right? That's why the prototype is so important. One thing is what they say, another thing is what they do. And Shiwa, I'm sure that you probably have stories of sharing that if you ask someone, would you like a comparison tool in between blah, 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 they'll say, yeah, I love it. Very different to actually putting the solution in front of them and seeing if they click on it or not, right? And what they do actually.
I think you're touching on motivations versus behavior and choosing the assumption that matches that experiment. So I think earlier on in my career, my experiment would be quite more of a linear timeline where I'll be kind of killing two birds with one stone. So an example would be like what content or what would be like in that product useful for you, and also would you buy it, would you engage with it, versus now the way that my experiments are planned are more in a spider web and running few at the same time. So I would have the more qual about what content is more important, because that's more the, like you said, the motivation, understanding, is this valuable to users? And then, like you said, would they purchase it? Would they actually click on it? Do they want this feature? And then running a feature stub test. And that the primary, I guess, assumption for that is engagement. I can ask in the qual, like in a validation survey or in user testing, would you buy this? But that's, I would kind of take that with a grain of salt. I wouldn't even ask that, because you want to spend that time on understanding, I guess, what the risky assumption there is. These are the three things that they want in that product. And so I get what you mean when in the beginning I'll ask all those questions in kind of lower confidence to high confidence experiments. Now I run probably 3 or 4 experiments. One is engagement. Would they buy this? Would they click on this? Do they want this? Well, another experiment, qual, the risky assumption there is what's the content inside it. So to kind of match the right experiment to the right assumption and determining if that assumption requires a more motivation one or requires a more kind of behavioral one, which is either more qual or quant, and determining the risk levels on that, confidence levels experiment you choose as from that as well.
Hey, somebody said critical friends. Be super careful, right? Whatever prototype you put in front of your mom or your good friends, you're probably gonna get a biased response. So like ideally try to find the customer, like an unknown quantity, because if you show it to your mom or your family, your dad, or I don't know, your sister, whatever, they either normally hate you because they hated you all your life, or they actually love you and they go, oh my God, amazing, keep doing it, and you're not getting the right feedback. So
That's absolutely the case. And I've experienced that myself. And I think one of the most important questions to ask anybody is, what don't you like about this?
Ah, that's a good one.
Right? And if you ask your mum, what don't you like about it, you'll always get to, no, I love everything. It's awesome, right? It's fantastic.
That's a good one.
So Gus, we heard a great case study of a mild failure of the blenders. Shiwa, have you experienced a failure that, in terms of prototyping, that has really given you some great lessons to take forward?
Probably more I guess like in a big organizations, I have more blockers rather than, there are big failures, but I think, like, for example, I just mentioned the feature stuff. Maybe in a smaller place, you can get away with it, but we have a big legal team and risk team here. So we can't just promise a product or promised a feature. And also the Wizard of Oz, we had lots of problems as well, because like, what if they became underinsured or we entered the wrong thing? And so we have to kind of find those customers up and kind of let them know or offer some sort of gift voucher. And we also have a lot of tools we can't use, like we can't use heat mapping because there's data governance issues and things like that with Hotjar and emotion tracking that, because a big company you can't use, but maybe smaller company, you don't have that data security or such strong governance. And so one way we got around that was we were going to put into an A/B test, and we could only measure kind of the viability assumptions, but the desirability assumptions around engagement, we can't track it if they actually read it or saw this. So the way I got around with it is putting thumbs up or thumbs down on those little things, and so that if they clicked on it, we know that they actually read it. And we also get an added bonus of knowing it's good or not. The bad side of running an A/B test is statistical significance. So using a calculator to determine that. And for our home insurance, it will take around 4 months to get 90% confidence levels. And our statistician requires 95%, but he can go to 90%. But anything lower than that, we cannot actually go back to the stakeholders and say, this is the case for the viability metrics, like this will work and this is worth building upon. So you have a problem where you can only run an A/B test on a website that will last more than 3 months. And you can't stop it earlier because you don't have that confidence level the business requires to spend the money to build this. So I guess that another failure of the blockages of running an A/B test. And another small thing was we have the luxury of having a creative technologist. So sometimes I don't need to create a prototype, so they could create a sandbox website and we can run all those experiments there. But the problem is we attached to a validation survey where we got Farron to kind of mock up for us, but they will click out of the survey and go into that website. Then we have to build something for them to click back to the survey to answer the questions. And then there was a lot of drop-off rates. And then we had to pay a lot of money for kind of the customers who didn't finish it. And I think also harping back to Mark and Gus about finding the problem is great, but also attaching it to the customer and the mindset. So I think bigger corporations have the luxury of maybe UX researchers and kind of service designers. So we have a lot of work done around the customers, personas and mindsets and their world and empathy maps, and kind of tying back, I guess, that product, which one it fits the kind of personas or mindset. And that actually costs quite a lot of money as well, because we want to justify this is a big enough impact, but it's only affecting this 1 or 2 certain mindsets or customers. And we actually have to pay extra 3K on top, I guess, for surveys, for example, tracking them. Which mindset are you? A, B, C, and D. Okay, and they go through a website and we can track those differences in what they do and if it worked or not. And so you have a survey that's 2.5K plus the 3K on top, and it can get pricey getting that customer product market fit. And like sometimes you have to kind of drop that. And yeah, so these are some of the blockers we have. I think one of the success stories, I think I worked in a bank, and it was a few years ago doing a chatbot, and we built a POC. And this was mainly to get the stakeholder feedback to build the chatbot. And we built it it was actually with me and developer. We just built it, we released it in NetBank, and we got people to actually use it. And in the end, it was a scrap and throw away because the business then had the money to investigate which platform with the data security and everything, because that one we could never use, like it will never pass the standards. And so I think that was a really success story from, like, I guess, a Shark Tank point of view, that we needed to build a chatbot for the bank, and we've got this data from the users that they actually used our POC, and it was a total throwaway.
Fantastic insight in innovating in big companies where bureaucracies can actually make you quite inert at times. We're going to quickly get into Q&A time because we've got lots of great questions here. Marc, I'm going to lead off with you. A question here from one of our students. How does prototyping differ from products to services?
I love that question. So from my perspective, obviously being a sort of a technologist, I don't see a massive difference. I think there are a set of underlying principles, and we've touched on a number of those today, that apply to both. And I think prototyping is a mindset, and then being able to apply that mindset appropriately and having a set of guiding principles that you as an individual kind of deeply connect to know that you're on the right track, whether that be products or services. And again, building that repeatability into what you're doing. So understanding the customer, working backwards from the customer, being frugal with your time. I don't think it's different whether it's a product or a service that you're looking to prototype. Obviously, there are different elements to the build. If you're building a product, you may have a manufacturing element to it. You may have to deal with production issues and things like that. It may be a higher cost. I don't know. It depends on the use case. But I don't particularly see a massive difference. I think the key thing is get anchored on a mental model and a set of tenets that work for you and your customers, and continue to iterate, and don't be afraid of failure, whether that's in product or services. I think just off the back of the failure conversation, every failure is an opportunity to learn, but just don't forget to ask yourself why.
Fantastic. Gus, I've got one for you. Prototyping is great. What's the next step?
Well, normally, I mean, if you look at the last few years literature, let's say the last 10 years, you know, it's gone from like MVP to prototyping to MVP, back to prototyping. There's pretotyping now as well. I don't know if you heard about pretotyping. Effectively, they're all steps on your journey to be able to launch something into the market, a solution to a problem into the market for your customers to transact with, rather with their time or with their money, right? Effectively, one or the other. So they're just steps on the journey. And look, they can be described in so many different ways that I'm not going to even attempt to say. Supposedly the prototype is a little bit earlier than the prototype, and the prototype supposedly is a bit earlier than the MVP, but the MVP gets added a bunch of different acronyms, and they add different words to it to make, you know, so, but effectively you are just building up on it. So if I use again the example of the juice company, you go from a little, you know, trolley with a blender on it that you're testing to maybe something a bit more formal with an umbrella on top, and you work illegally on the streets of Buenos Aires until you build up a bit of money to buy a second blender, to then you build up the next prototype, which is you sell some food with it, so you put a little fridge next to it, to eventually you get yourself a space to rent, to you know, etc., etc. And you keep moving through all those things. Now, some products or services allow you to really break it down and move from one thing to the other. Some are a bit more complex, and you need to have a critical number of features before you can consider it effectively viable, right? Or usable, if you will. So there is different challenges. If, you know, in other words, you can't, you know, back in the days to work at Lonely Planet, you can't kind of prototype half a chapter of a potential book that might have 300 pages, right? It's like you either, like the smallest piece will have to be a chapter, let's say, before you build a book, and you can test that maybe with, but I would say that you could almost scratch your head at anything, and you can break it down and build little steps across the way, even if it's physical. Doesn't matter what servers. This is why I say this is the hardest job. That the ideas about how to test the idea is actually. But if you're good at that, you'll save a ton of time. You save a ton of money, and it means that you get to do more rolls of the dice in your lifetime rather than less, right? And innovation is a volume game, right? So, or entrepreneurship is a volume game. You need as many shots as possible because the odds are stacked squarely against you. The chances are you're going to screw it up, right? So the more rolls of the dice you get, the better.
Yeah, great point. And there's a question in the chat channel, in the Q&A channel, about how do you overcome the fear of failure? Would anybody like to have a crack at that one?
Avoid school.
Hey, come on, they're university students.
So it's a really interesting question, and it's a very hard one to answer. Fear of failure, I think, exists in a couple of different spaces. The first one is the personal fear of failure. How will I be perceived if I fail? But that, and there's two aspects even to that one, right? How will I feel as an individual? And then how will others perceive me? And if you think about an organization, we put entrepreneurship and innovation and prototyping in the context of organizations, which many of you are already working in or will be working in. In an organization, you need to work to have a culture where failure is acceptable and actually is encouraged. And the way you get there is by building processes, systems, and mechanisms that allow failures to happen fast and happen early and happen cheap. So the downstream impacts of that are not massively significant on individuals, teams, divisions, business units, corporations. If you're a standalone entrepreneur and you're going out there in terms of a startup, I would say if you're looking to be a CEO, a CTO, you want to build that culture of experimentation, and experiments can fail. Therefore, you need to build in this idea that every prototype is based off a hypothesis, and hypotheses, I can't even talk. Hypotheses have two outcomes, right? They're either a successful outcome or a failure outcome, and both of those are acceptable. But it's how you get there cost effectively in a way that's rational and thought through. The second thing is, how do you as an individual take failure, right? Especially if you're an entrepreneur. And I use this mechanism of the 5 whys. And I continually ask myself, why? Why do I feel this way? Well, I feel this way because I failed. Well, why did I fail? Well, I failed because I missed this fundamental assumption, or I didn't test my market, or I didn't blend the right juices. Well, why didn't I? Well, I probably missed, I only spoke to my mum. Maybe I actually really missed the actual customers that I need to talk. Well, why did I miss those customers? Oh, I don't understand my market, right? And if you peel back the onion, you'll find a point where over time, you do that enough where you start to become comfortable, because it stops becoming a failure and starts becoming a learning, and you apply it in your next roll of the dice, I think, as Gus put it.
Yeah, great answer, Mark. And we use the 5 whys as well. And it's a great way of actually, as you said, peeling that onion back to what is the actual question that you're trying to answer here.
And don't be easy on yourself, guys. So if you're asking yourself the 5 whys, don't ask 5 easy questions. Go to your confidant, go to your coach, go to your mentor, and have them give you the 5 whys.
Yeah, good point. Shiwa, how do you actually analyze feedback from customers when you are prototyping?
That's really interesting. Depends on the type of experiment it is. The more quant ones are quite easy because Mark touched on it. You have as your riskiest assumptions. I usually break my riskiest assumptions into 4 categories. They're either desirability, viability, operational, or feasibility. And depending on your risky assumption, I see as an opinion. Hypothesis is turning that opinion that's testable. And so from that assumption, you might have 3 mini hypotheses broken out into that. And then the next column is your success metric tied to that. So like I said, depending if it's a quant experiment, that's easy. You'll be like 4 out of 6 said this, 50% of users clicked on this and that. And then you have the tick, cross. And then overall, I'll be the big tick or cross over that main riskiest assumption. And so if it's a qual, then it just goes back to normal synthing methods. So you can either do a top-down or bottom-down synthing methods. I think that's like already a big topic in itself, but yeah, there's like a certain way that you synth. I usually do the bottom to top approach, where I get, if it's like a user testing or 6 people or from a survey, I get different colored or poster notes from the person, and then you kind of group them, and then you form a theme. And then from that theme, you either have like 3 or 4 insights, and then you kind of create your learnings, and then your top 3 key learnings, and then you create the recommendations from that. But the hardest bit, which I don't have to do, which I guess it's different from a UX designer, I work with POs and PMs. They make the hard decision to continue, if they want to continue, pivot or kill, or we find another learning and we go into a different tangent. And I think working with a lot of POs, it depends on their personality, and I know what they'll want to do. I find, I don't want to say this, but maybe not more neurotic personality POs, they need a lot of data, need a lot of safety, and not a lot of thorough and padding. So they're the ones who are least likely to kill an idea. For me, it's fine. I'm more like a bit like Ariana Grande, thank you, next. Because as a UX designer, I have a whole backlog of ideas to choose, so I can just go to the next one. For a PO, they're more invested, and so I can give them the result and I give them my opinion. And if they're more, maybe they need more thoroughness, they need more data, they're less on intuition, I know they'll most likely want to run another higher confidence experiments versus I worked with other POs who are more, can gather the high level, they're more intuition, and they're more like, I'm ready to kill it. But then the downside is they might have killed an idea too early. So that's my personal opinion of POs and product managers that I work with who make that hard decision. I don't have to make it, I just give the result.
What a luxury. And just for some of our audience, a PO is?
Product owner. So they're the ones who, and then our product manager is more the higher journey levels. But sometimes we have PMs who take on the product owner role as well.
Yep, well done.
Maybe if I could, David, could I just jump in there, maybe just add a sort of one of the ways that we think about it. So when we think about making decisions in data, it's a fine line. How much data do you need to make a good decision, right? And you want to be right a lot in the decisions that you're making. It doesn't mean you're going to be right all the time. So how do you find the balance? So one of the mechanisms that we use, and you've heard me talk a lot about mechanisms and tenets, because this is the way we kind of think, or the way I think. We have this concept of a one-way and versus a two-way door. So a two-way door is a decision that is easily reversible. So do we go with blue or do we go with green? It's easy to change a color on a website, right? You don't necessarily need 100% of the data to make that decision, because it's not a one-way door. Things like signing a contract with a partner, with a distributor for a new blender or a rental property, that's a one-way decision. It's not easily reversible. It has significant consequences. So I just encourage everybody to really think about, what is a one-way door versus a two-way door? And if it's a two-way door, you don't need 100% of the data. Sometimes you don't even need 50% of the data, because you can back out of that decision very quickly. And in an entrepreneurial space, frugality of your time and speed is critically important. So paralysis by analysis should not be a thing. Identify one way versus two way, take educated risks, and be right a lot. It doesn't mean be right all the time.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask her a question of Gus, but please jump in here, Shiwa or Mark as well. And it's really from, I guess, the perspective of our students, many of whom are really, busting their chops to start a business. What is the importance? And I'll preface this by saying that not every business actually needs investment. And I want to make that very, very clear. It's about what's fit for that business in terms of, is it going to scale? Is it not going to scale? Who are their customers? What their product or service is? But let's just assume that you are after investment. What is the importance of an MVP?
So, David, effectively, an investor is looking primarily for you to have proven to yourself that this is worth your time, right? First and foremost. And if you've proven to yourself that this is worth all your time and energy and desire, and you've done that confidently with evidence, right? Therefore, an MVP or a prototype of such that has given you the tangible evidence that tests your, most complex assumptions of this solution, then all of a sudden it's easier for me to make a decision of imparting with my money or not, right? But I'm not going to impart with any of my money unless you have actually, first and foremost, convinced yourself. It's not how convincing you sound, it has, well, you have convinced yourself, right? Which is very different in a way, right? So, and this is why the MVP plays such an important role. By the way, the same way as an investor looks at a potential investment and looks at the evidence, that founder or founders have gathered to prove their hypothesis, a customer, a client of AWS, before they put their money down to pay AWS for something, will look for the same kind of evidence. They'll go and say, yeah, Mark, sure, but how do I know that whatever you've done is whatever, legit, yeah? And a stakeholder in Shiwa's case, right, a PO or even higher up, if the investment is bigger, let's say the CEO of the company, will say to the PO, to the product owner, but hang on a minute, how do you know that tweaking this thing on the website is going to make us whatever it is? So it's all about that evidence. The difference in a founder's perspective as an entrepreneur is that unlike the PO that has a job, right, which is to escalate that up and they don't have jobs that the company pays, in this one, your skin is in the game. So the loss is that your time and effort and potentially your own money, if you put your own money onto it as well, it's gone. So, that's why it's often good, if you get the opportunity, I always say to people, you don't need to necessarily pick one or the other path. Pick both if you can. Go and work for corporate for a while. It's fantastic. It's amazing. You learn a shit ton, right? And then come back or play on the side, or have a hustle on the side and learn both, because there's a lot of similarities in between them and some differences, of course.
Hey, it's really interesting, Gus, to listen. I completely agree. And I see the difference between innovation is a job, entrepreneurship is a passion, right? You've got to love what you're doing. So when I think about those two, I think MVP purely exists in the realm of corporates and established businesses. If I think about pre-revenue, startups looking for seed funding, I think that MLP is more important. You need to demonstrate that you have a product that you love. So minimum lovable product, right? That your passion comes through to your investors, and that it's clear this is not a job, right? This is a passion. So you've got to love what you're doing. Entrepreneurship is not a job, it's a passion. You've got to love it. You've got to love your product, and your customers and your investors have to love your product. It's not the same as a minimum viable product.
Yeah.
MVP for me is still an experiment, but a high confidence experiment. So for me, the product is still in experiment mode. For example, I give a 5-star rating for confidence, and I keep talking about de-risking an idea. So like a 2 out of 5 star will be user testing. An A/B test is a 4 out of 5 star risk for me. When it's an MVP, it's a 5 out of 5 star confidence test. So for me, it's still an experiment, and you release the MVP and you're monitoring it. And if it goes well, then you build the next brick, and then it's really in that delivery land. So I reframe it as MVP isn't finished. It's still on a 5 out of 5 experiment, that confidence level.
Great point, Shiwa. Look, we've just about run out of time, and there's a bucket load of questions here. We could go on for hours. This is such a fascinating topic, and you've been such a great panel. Is there any one final piece of advice that you'd give our young entrepreneurs, and indeed our community out there, about prototyping?
I'll give you a quick one. Make sure that you never forget that you can always use proxies. So you don't have to build everything from scratch yourself, right? Sometimes you can just use a proxy and tweak things. I developed an app back in the day with a good friend of mine just by repurposing Trello, which is another app for something else. And I just used it to mimic the behavior that I was expecting from the users that I invited to come in and play with it. And once we did, then we've experimented with the behaviors, and then we built our own app on the back of it. So often you can proxy things with lots of other tools that are out there in the market.
Great insight. Shiwa?
I think if you have a personality that likes maths and analytics, it might be worth looking into building your prototyping skills, because it's once you learn the basic of a bit of coding, then all the kind of harder and like prototyping tools rely on that logic, and it's like Latin. Once you've learned it, you can kind of get most of the prototyping tools, and you can do quite a lot of like good things in like for digital prototypes, and it'll open your doors to a lot of prototyping tools. So if you're leaning towards it and have that personality, but if you don't, then it's like it will be really hard to like you'll get bored of it. I think you might stick to the easier prototypes.
Fantastic. And just to be clear, everybody, Shiwa was not recommending you go and learn Latin. Mark.
I was trying to think if I could quickly come back with a quip in Latin, but I have zero Latin, so that was a dead end very quickly. Look, I would say go build. Don't be scared. Doing something is better than doing nothing. 2 is better than 1 is better than none. Understand your one-way doors, understand your two-way doors, fail fast, be frugal with your time, and build. Just move. Moving and getting velocity is critical in today's environment. So just build, don't be scared, and be passionate about what you're doing, or have passion for what you're doing.
Fantastic, guys. That evidence-based entrepreneurship is something we teach, and we teach do and not talk about do. And which wraps up with that quite nicely. Now, before I thank our panel, I would like to thank everybody for coming along, and I especially want to thank my team for organising this. Great job again, Anna and Nikki. Thank you very much. Thank you to Shiwa, Mark, and Gus. You've been absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure our students in our community have gotten a great deal out of this. As I said, I think we could go on for another 3 or 4 hours, but time is valuable, Gus. Thank you, everybody, and nice to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Stay well, stay safe.